Hello everybody, it's me, Fee, or Fiona Timms, otherwise known as White Zulu, author of my autobiography of the same name, and I welcome you all to another chapter of my book. I do hope you're all enjoying my life story, and I must thank all of you for being such dedicated subscribers, especially those who have written such complimentary comments below my videos. They are much appreciated. I would like to point out that the previous South African flag hanging on the wall behind me is not a political statement. It is simply a piece of history in the background of my first 50 years of my life, being born and growing up in my beloved mother country, South Africa. My autobiography, White Zulu, is not a political commentary, and frankly describes my experiences of growing up with the Zulu tribe as my family. That flag is simply a piece of cloth signifying the history of South Africa. It was originally used by the Union of South Africa from 1928 to 1961, and later the Republic of South Africa until 1994. There was nothing. Silence. There were no colours either, just varying shades of dark green, grey and brown. Skeletal trees etched their bare branches against the overcast sky, and there were no rustling leaves to break the silence, which added to the eeriness of this place. Our gum trees made a sea-like rushing noise nearly all the time, except on the hottest, most shimmery and airless days, when the leaves hung limply in the baking heat, giving off the lovely, sharp scent of eucalyptus, which I always found so comforting. I suppose I associated it with my nanny, Evelina, who had raised me from infancy till I went off to school aged 12. And the way I loved her, it was her favourite place to sit, her back resting against the vast trunk of a gum tree with its papery, peeling grey bark, the comforting, safe way I felt when I was with her. It was far too cold to sit for longer than a minute, and I began to shiver, so I got to my feet to continue my stroll around the grounds. The dark, almost black, dripping pine trees didn't look inviting, so I walked around to the right, where I found a flight of mossy stone steps, which led me back up to the house and around the side, where I found a concrete tennis court. I continued past the court and found myself on the driveway between the house and the main lodge, more correctly, the upper gatehouse. So I wandered on, following the bend in the tarmac, past the main entrance, an entre building, which I discovered was a squash court. Beyond this was a huge walled garden, the kitchen garden. I opened the gate and stepped in to find about half an acre of various types of vegetable planted in neat rows. There were some sort of berry bushes under netting, and fruit trees grew all around the inside of the tall walls, which were built from honey-coloured bricks. Gnarled old apple, pear and plum trees were espaliered. That's when they're trained to grow up against a wall and spread out against the lovely mellow surface, sheltered from the vicious icy winds and warmed by the weak sunshine soaking into the porous crumbly bricks. I was enchanted by the tranquility of the place. As I stood there looking around, a small off-white long-haired Scotty terrier wearing a tartan waistcoat came bouncing towards me along one of the brick laid paths. He gave me an ecstatic greeting, standing on his hind legs and paddling in the air with his front feet, being careful not to touch my trousers with his muddy paws. Then he crouched down on his elbows, his hairy backside in the air, his tail whirring as he sniffed at my boots. He jumped around me a couple of times before trotting briskly off to a glass hothouse in one corner of the garden, his small tail wagging merrily. Intrigued, I'd never seen a dog wearing clothes before. I followed him as he evidently meant me to. I found an elderly man wearing a cream Aran woolly hat over his grey curls, standing at a bench in the hothouse, transferring seedlings from a pot into a bigger tub. He was short, like Johnny, but tubby and much older. "Good day to you." He put a soil-covered glove to his hat. "I'm Bobby, and that's Hamish, the wee rascal. You must be Mrs. Ferrier. Welcome to Glencruton." His Highland brogue was so strong that he sounded as though he was being held back on a choke chain. I thanked him and then looked around the glass structure. I'd never seen anything like it, and he told me it was the hothouse. Bobby showed me the paraffin heaters that kept the temperature high enough for him to be able to grow gloriously, brilliantly coloured tropical flowers with soft, delicate petals. On every shelf in the hothouse were pots containing sweet-scented blooms, the names of which I never learned, but were so familiar to me as they grew wild in Durban. Scarlet, purple, pink, mauve, white, and deep red, their luxurious heads stood proudly, and their dizzy-making fragrance filled the long glass shed. I recognized begonias, though, as the Durban Parks Department planted them by the thousand all over traffic islands and along the middle of freeways. I also saw creamy arum lilies, which grew alongside our riverbanks, and crimson poinsettias. I cut them and take them up to the house once they're in flower, so that they can be arranged in vases for the rooms, Bobby said. At least I think that's what he said, as I found his brogue so difficult to understand. There was a bed filled with ripe red tomatoes and rows of curly lettuce, even a cucumber vine or two. What sprang to my mind immediately was whether this garden was out on the farm or in our little garden in Durban. Not one of this would ever have grown, thanks to the baboons and the monkeys. "What sort of dog is he?" I asked, looking at Hamish, who was lying on the floor at his master's feet, licking mud off one shaggy grey front paw, and looking pleased with himself. He reminded me a little bit of Pitts, my own beloved little dog, who'd been my faithful companion for over half my life. "Och, he's a West Highland Terrier. Will you excuse me now, Mrs. Ferrier? I must away to me dinner." Bobby pulled on a warm coat and picked up a bicycle which was lying on its side just outside the hothouse. It had a small wire basket carrier on the front handlebars, and he held the bike upright and then whistled to Hamish, who jumped and landed neatly in the basket and sat there with a proprietary air. I walked with them to the main gate, and then, with a cheerful, "I'm here 3 days a week, so come and visit us again on Friday," Bobby swung his leg over the saddle and pedalled off down the road. My last view of them was the bike picking up a fair speed down the long, steep hill, while Hamish sat majestically in his basket, paws on the rim, his fur blowing back from his face and his ears fluttering in the breeze as they raced off down to Oban for their dinner. I had enjoyed myself so much with the convivial pair that I walked down to the kitchen garden most weekday afternoons from then on, unless the weather was just too bad to go out at all. On the occasional sunny day, although the air was still biting cold, I sat, well muffled up on a dry log, with my back against the aged wall in the most sheltered part of the kitchen garden, and raised my face to the weak sunshine. I rested my hands on my bump and enjoyed the fluttering and tickling in my belly as the baby moved around. This was the only time I felt really connected to my baby. There was so much going on at the house, so many traps to dodge, and Bar and Bob's malevolent, tricky little games to avoid. I had to be on my guard all the time. Watching my back took all of my concentration, and I felt too weary to do anything other than go into a numb stupor during the times I ought to be resting, relaxing, and making mental preparations for our new arrival. In theory, it was supposed to be the happiest time in my life. Here I was, married to the man I loved, and expecting our first child. My pregnancy was proceeding well. There were no physical problems either with me or my developing fetus, and yet I just felt bleak, terrified, and completely alone. I felt I was losing Fred too. The intimacy we'd shared in Durban was being eroded day by day. He came back from his state duties despondent and drained, and there was barely time to greet him before we were summoned to the table by Jimmy's gong. When we could get away from the post-dinner drunken maelstrom, all he wanted to do was sink, exhausted, into bed and sleep. I lay awake and worried. Now and again, just as I was finally dozing off, there was a loud crash from the story above ours, where Weenie had the floor to herself. She had a bedroom, a dressing room, and a bathroom up there, where the children's nursery was. The bang sounded like her flinging open a door, and then I heard the thud of footsteps as she stampeded along the passage. She shouted something loudly, and then I heard another door slam. Crikey! I jolted upright in our bed the first night it happened, my heart racing with fright and staring at the ceiling in our pitch-dark room. What was that? Weenie, muttered Fred drowsily. She doesn't always sleep so well, so she gets up and roams around, slamming doors and crashing furniture about. Roams, I muttered. Sounded more like a buffalo stampede to me. She doesn't realize she's disturbing us. She's not really aware of other people's sensibilities. As you know, it's part of her problem. Just ignore it. And he turned over and pulled the cover up over his ears. That's all very well now, I thought, but what happens when the baby arrives? Would Weenie's nocturnal crashes and banging wake the baby as well as us? Or would it be the other way round? Either way, it didn't bode well for restful nights for us, mine especially. As I sat in the walled kitchen garden, my mind paced back and forth from problem to problem, all of them apparently insoluble. My bones began to ache from the chill, and I shifted my position on the log. I looked up at the pallid blue sky, hoping the watery sunshine would warm me and watched the vapor contrails of jets passing high over us, enviously picturing the passengers sitting in rows, headed for other countries. Oh God, how I wished we were on one of those planes and headed back to Africa. Actual physical waves of homesickness swept over me as I swallowed back the tears, which I felt, if I let go, would overwhelm me. The day of my appointment at the hospital arrived, and I drove down in our newly acquired Rover 2000. The mothers-to-be met in a large room on the ground floor with big bay windows overlooking the town of Oban. There were 6 of us, and we lay on mats on the floor to do our exercises. The girl next to me was in her 8th month and giggled infectiously as she barreled about on her mat, struggling to get to her feet after our class. I offered her my hand to haul her up, and thanking me, she introduced herself as Mariota. She was a year older than I was, making her 22, and she had a mass of bright red curly hair, freckles, and a sweet dimpled smile. "Come on down to the cafe and have a cup of tea with me now," she said. I was delighted to spend some time with somebody of my own age and in a similar condition. We sat and compared notes. This was her first baby as well, and her husband was a boat captain, sailing one of the big Miss Baines ferries, which shuttled back and forth to the Isle of Mull, which was just visible across Oban Bay. That's the same Isle of Mull, the Paul McCartney song, Mull of Kintyre, same one. I was reluctant to part company with my cheerful, bubbly new friend. Her warmth restored me. "Would you like to get together with me again?" I asked. "Oh, aye," she said enthusiastically. "Are you free tomorrow? If so, come up and spend the afternoon with me. I'm on my own all day. I'm all on my own up there most of the day," I said. She knew where Glen Cruton was, as all Oban folk did. She said she'd drive up at about 3 the following afternoon. I sat in the big drawing room waiting for the crunch of gravel announcing her arrival and greeted her. The place seemed deserted and there was no sign of any staff around. I led the way through the house to the small sitting room with an open fire in the grate. We sat and chatted for a while before I took her into the kitchen to put the kettle on. It was the first time I'd ever been into the huge kitchen. There were 2 enormous cookers, one Aga, one gas, a vast fridge, a couple of chest freezers, and down the centre a great long scrubbed wooden table. I located an electric kettle and some mugs, and we took our tea back to the sitting room, where we spent a couple of really pleasant hours laughing and talking. Apart from our wedding reception the week before, this was the first time I'd really laughed since I'd arrived at Glen Cruton, and as she was getting into her car later on to go home to cook her husband's tea, I asked Mariota if she'd like to make her visit a regular event, as well as meeting up at our prenatal classes. "I'd love to," she said, and we arranged to catch up at the next class. I caught a glimpse of Johnny's face peering out from behind one of the garages, and then he quickly ducked back out of sight, which I thought was odd. That's all for this week. I forgot to say hi to Clive, hi to Henry LaRue, hi Scotty, hello Tony from New Zealand. I want to thank John Muslane for being my sound engineer and being such a magnificent tower of strength throughout load shedding and whatever He's a Boer who makes a plan. Nothing will get him or stop him from getting things done. He's an amazing man. I'll see you next week with more Glenn Cruton. Bye-bye. That is all for the time being, and there's more to come next week. I would like to thank John Moslane for putting aside his Friday afternoons to help me produce these videos. Without him, I could not do this. I would also like to thank Sean van Vuren for his sterling work in uploading my videos to my YouTube channel, adding the photos, as well as managing my channel so professionally. If you would like to know more about my other works, I have written 5 books in all, and each one is autobiographical. Please visit my website at www.whitezulubook.com, where you will find a lot more information as well as plenty of photographs. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed my life story, and there is plenty more to come. A thumbnail photo will be attached each week, and thank you so much for all your support and all the very kind remarks you make in complimenting me on my work. I really appreciate it. Goodbye.